welcomed his guests in front of the quilted door at Town and Country, and they never went away hungry. Thank you.
Since the theme is drinking and dining in Dallas, I'd like to show you a selection from our ephemera collection. MA01-5 has menus, political flyers, and other items of interest to Dallas and Texas history. The Dallas restaurants are organized in alphabetical order, and you'll see different restaurants you recognize, some still in existence, but many defunct.
For many people, the quintessential Texas cuisine is barbecue. Here to share with us some of the history of barbecue in Dallas is Daniel Vaughn, the barbecue editor at Texas Monthly. He is the author of Prophets of Smoked Meat, A Journey Through Texas Barbecue, and co-author of Whole Hog, The Gospel of Carolina Barbecue. Vaughn has eaten at more than 2,000 barbecue joints, most of them in Texas. The title of Daniel's talk today is The Enduring Influence of Shoemaker's Barbecue.
We can all picture a barbecue sandwich. Some smoked meat, usually chopped brisket in Texas, barbecue sauce, pickles, and onions, all between a bun. It's the most common way that we eat barbecue in Texas. But when did it take hold? The meat market style of barbecue that began and still flourishes in Central Texas wasn't sandwich-based. It was defined as meat on butcher paper. We still see plenty of that in Texas. Just look at Instagram, my own account included. But the visual allure of those generous barbecue platters comes at a price. All that variety of smoked meats is expensive. The barbecue sandwich is the humble yet delicious alternative. One of the restaurants that helped define the contents of a Texas barbecue sandwich was Shoemaker's Barbecue, right here in Dallas. The first one was opened by Reuben Shoemaker on Commerce Street in downtown Dallas in 1926. That is 1 year before the first location of the Pig Stand that opened in Dallas, which would go on to become a nationwide chain serving pig sandwiches. Shoemaker's was known for beef, but not brisket. Specifically, they used beef navel plates. The navel plate comes from the belly of the steer. In those days, you could buy a whole one intact with all the rib bones. If you've had a smoked beef short rib, one of those dino ribs, then you've eaten a portion of the beef navel plate. At Shoemaker's, they would cook them whole over a wood fire. Once it was tender enough, they would slide the bones out and chop the meat, the whole thing, fat and all, for serving on sandwiches. The meat had plenty of fat, like chopped beef bacon, so those sandwiches were juicy. Reuben Shoemaker learned this method from his brother-in-law, Julius William Kane, who went by Will, Willie, and Bill. Bill Kane had opened a barbecue joint in Dallas several years earlier. A 1956 article in the Dallas Morning News explained their relationship. Quote, after his brother-in-law, veteran barbecue man Bill Kane, showed him that hickory smoke and a spicy sauce could make plain beef into a more profitable commodity, Shoemaker entered the business. Reuben Shoemaker lived with his wife Ruth on the family farm he grew up on outside the East Texas town of Winsboro in Wood County. They moved to Dallas to work in the barbecue business that Ruth's brother Bill Kane had opened. Just like Kane's, the Shoemakers didn't season the meat before it went on the pit. That flavoring came with the sauce that was applied with a mop to every sandwich before it was crowned with a bun. It was a thin sauce, mostly water and spices, so it coated the meat really well. A table in the middle of the cramped dining area held the rest of the toppings. Pickles, onions, sweet relish, spicy peppers were available for customers to dress their sandwiches however they liked. Any bits of the sandwich that dripped onto the floor would be soaked up by the sawdust beneath the feet of the customers. If you wanted to dine in, there were school desks lining the wall. If that sounds familiar, maybe it's because you've sat at a similar school desk at Sonny Bryan's original location on Inwood in Dallas. These days, that place is the epitome of old-school Dallas barbecue, but they borrowed their look from the Shoemakers. By the time Sonny Bryan's opened in 1958, Reuben Shoemaker had already sold 3 million barbecue sandwiches. Heck, Red Bryan, Sonny's father, even once worked at Shoemaker's Barbecue. The Shoemaker way may have started with Kane's, but the former was short-lived. The The Shoemaker name would soon overshadow Cain's thanks to its rapid expansion. First, it was Reuben's brother Herbert who followed him from Wood County to Dallas and opened a location on Jackson Street. Another brother, R.T. Shoemaker, came next and settled into a location at 1100 Main. In the 1947 Dallas directory, there were 4 Shoemaker's locations, and all of them were downtown. At its peak, there were 14 total locations of Shoemaker's Barbecue in Dallas. Each brother owned their own group of individual stores, so they never became a full-fledged chain operation, but the restaurants were nearly identical in menu, ambiance, and service. Reuben Shoemaker retired in 1969. On his last day at the helm, he told the Dallas Morning News, "There was only one day in all those years that I didn't eat lunch at my own place. I had a bad cold and I had to go out and find some chicken noodle soup. But the next day, it was back to barbecued beef." He lived to age 95. Maybe it was thanks to the barbecue. Upon retirement, Reuben handed the reins to his nephew Buck Raley, who ran it with his wife Evelyn until the restaurant was demolished in 1975. The former site of the restaurant, a block east of the George Allen Courts building on Commerce Street, is now a parking lot. You can't visit the original Shoemakers, but there are 4 other restaurants that still carry on the Shoemakers barbecue legacy. The most unexpected is in California. After R.T. Shoemaker's wife passed away, he married Sybil Browning, who already had 2 kids of her own. Joe Jack Browning was one of them. He worked at Shoemaker's in Dallas with R.T. and then joined the Navy during World War II. He was stationed in San Diego. In 1947, Joe and his new wife, Lila, opened the barbecue pit on Market Street in downtown San Diego. They installed some school desks, threw some sawdust on the floor, some beef in the pit, and cooked the Shoemaker's way. The beef sandwich is still the most popular item at the 2 remaining locations of the restaurant. The relish bar is well stocked with raw red onions, tomatoes, pickles, jalapenos, pepperoncini, yellow peppers, and sweet relish. Closer to home, an old Shoemaker's employee, Ernie Carroll, opened Ernie's Pit Barbecue in Greenville in 1948. The sawdust is long gone, but there's still school desks lining the wall of the dining room. Josh and Kristen Thomas bought the place in 2018 and have added quite a bit to the menu. Smoked boudin, pork ribs, and the loaded fries are all available. But the Ernie Burger, which Ernie Carroll served, is still plenty popular. It's a brisket sandwich topped with barbecue sauce, yellow mustard, and sweet pickle relish. The Shoemaker's legacy is also carried on way up in Lubbock at Tom and Bingo's Hickory Pit Barbecue. Tom Clanton and Gaston Ray Bingo Mills were distant cousins from the town of Quitman, not far from Winsboro. Clanton went to Dallas to work for Shoemaker's when he was 13, but family legend has it that he was fired from Shoemaker's for not cleaning up the sawdust on the floor. He moved back to Wood County and hooked up with Mills. According to the Visit Lubbock website, quote, "The teens had bought a cow from their grandpa and were going door to door in Tyler, Texas, trying to sell the meat. After having one door after another shut in their faces, they decided to barbecue the meat, of which they sold every last bite to the same people who had shut their doors on them just hours earlier. They knew that barbecue was their new future." The boys saved their money and moved to Amarillo about 1946 and eventually opened 6 locations of Tom and Bingo's. Their influence led others to copy, like Doug's Barbecue, that opened in 1958 and is still operated in Amarillo. At Doug's, they serve mainly sandwiches and also have that generous condiment bar. The legendary Tom and Bingo's location on 34th Street in Lubbock is the only one left. The beef sandwich will be made with brisket instead of navel, and they also serve ham sandwiches and 8th-pound Bingo burgers. In 2012, they even added sausage sandwiches. Tom's son, Dwayne Clanton, passed away suddenly in 2017, and his son-in-law, Ian Timmons, took over. Timmons has been trying to modernize the place a bit, with sides other than potato chips, with house-made sausages and sliced brisket and pork rib platters. But the barbecue sandwiches are still the heart of the business. In the center of the small dining room is a condiment table filled with pickles, onions, relish, hot peppers, and barbecue sauce, and small school desks flank both sides of the small dining room. And remember Bill Cain, the guy who helped get the Shoemakers into the barbecue business? He had another sister, Tommy Cain, who married James Thomas Bailey. They learned the barbecue business from Bill Cain too, and together they opened Bailey's Barbecue in downtown Fort Worth in 1931. and it's still operating every weekday for lunch. It's surrounded by the towering buildings of downtown Fort Worth, and Bailey's looks like it's from another place and time, because it is. Like all the other joints tied to the Shoemakers, Bailey's menu is sandwich focused. Current owner Brenda Pfeiffer has added pork ribs and barbecue plates to the menu, but most folks take their sandwiches wrapped in white paper to go. And if you want the best approximation about what it would be like to eat at the original Shoemakers barbecue in Dallas, then Bailey's is your best bet. Get a sliced brisket sandwich, top it with pickles, onions, and sweet relish from the topping bar in the middle of the restaurant, squeeze on some of their spicy barbecue sauce, and taste a bit of Texas barbecue history.
Ethnic cuisines are an especially important aspect of the dining experience in Dallas, reflecting the increasingly diverse population of the area. We'll conclude the conference with a panel discussion on the cultural aspect of food, identity, community, and creating a sense of home in North Texas. Moderating our panel will be Kim Pierce, an award-winning food journalist who was on the staff of the Dallas Morning News for more than 30 years, where she focused on farmers markets and local sustainable foodways. In addition, she has written for publications as diverse as the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink and community-based Edible Dallas and Fort Worth. She and her partner, Alfonso Savola, are also urban farmers who grow hoja santa for prize-winning mozzarella company cheeses and for local chefs. Our panelists include Dr. Betsy Brody of Collin College, Alberto Gonzalez of the Dallas Mexican American Historical League, and Dia Barry Mitchell of the Dallas Historical Society. Kim Pierce will tell you more about each of them as she begins our discussion. Thank you.
Well, hello, I'm Kim Pierce, and I want to welcome everyone, join in welcoming everyone to the Legacies Dallas History Conference. On this panel, we're going to discuss the cultural aspect of food, identity, community, and creating a sense of home in North Texas. Our panelists are going to cover an amazing and delicious amount of ground, highlighting some of the seminal experiences of an array of groups, from Blacks and Mexicans to more newly arrived Asian immigrants and refugees from places as far-flung as India and Vietnam. So let me introduce these panelists to you. First of all, Albert Gonzalez is one of the founders of the Dallas Mexican American Historical League. You could say that Albert has actually lived the Mexican experience. He grew up in Little Mexico, the barrio that formed a century ago north of downtown, off Harry Hines by Pike Park, where his family had a funeral business. Albert was the owner of Gonzalez Funeral Home for many years, retiring in 2013. While Albert provides context for the larger story of how Mexicans settled in Dallas, I'm hoping at some point in the discussion that we can get him to tell the story of his early memory of helping his dad, who was the first Mexican milkman in Dallas, tell you a little bit about delivering milk with his father and his memories of that. Dia Barry Mitchell works with the Dallas Historical Society and is president of Nostalgia Black, a multimedia company committed to preserving Dallas history. She's going to tell you more about this in her presentation. Among other aspects, she's going to talk about practices and traditions across time, showing how food that sustained enslaved Blacks also sustained and united Blacks throughout their modern struggle for freedom. Dr. Betsy Brody was the recipient of the 2018, Dr. Betsy Brody was the recipient in 2018 of the Charlton Oral History Research Grant, awarded by Baylor University's Institute of Oral History. Through this grant, Betsy created the Becoming Texans, Becoming Americans oral history collection, documenting the arrival, settlement, and integration of Vietnam refugees in North Texas following the fall of Saigon in 1975. Her current research, undertaken as an ACLS Mellon Fellow, that's a mouthful, even without saying what does ACLS stand for. It's the American Council of Learned Studies. It's an oral history project entitled Digging In, which explores how food, culture, and class shaped the story of Asian Dallas. Betty graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 1994 with a bachelor's degree in political science and Japanese, and was a Fulbright scholar at Niigata University in Japan. She completed her master's and doctorate at Notre Dame. So, without further ado, let's hear the presentations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Albert Gonzalez, and I'm here to talk to you about my passion of history, in particular, the barrio of Little Mexico that was here in Dallas. And we're going to focus on the McKinney Avenue, the commercial hub of Dallas, Little Mexico. The settlement of Little Mexico barrio in Dallas began with the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. As Mexicans were fleeing the turmoil of civil war in their homeland, coming to the United States in search of stability, jobs, and better life for their families, the barrio surrounding the area that is now Pike Park offered affordable housing and a close proximity to Dallas downtown commercial service. With the construction of railroads beginning in the late 19th century, Dallas had become a business and trading center and was booming. It needed workers for the agriculture, transportation, and manufacturing industries. The Mexicans, referred to as colonists in the beginning, arrived at the time of segregation was the law. Most did not have the command of the English language. The 1907 Dallas City Charter had a section titled Segregation of the Races, which authorized the Dallas City Council to pass ordinance distinguishing the use of city blocks by race. Socially, they were not welcome or allowed at most places, such as restaurants, parks, swimming pools, or theaters. Consequently, the newcomers were forced to be self-sustaining by providing support, service, and goods to each other. Many started mom-and-pop businesses from their homes and brought in products from Mexico, which were both favored and familiar, such as newspapers, candies, and medicines. Others started restaurants, tortilla factories, and grocery stores, while their various small businesses speculated around the neighborhood. McKinney Avenue became the hub of the commercial center. One of the businesses that got started on McKinney Avenue and continues to the present day, more than a century later, is the El Phoenix Cafe. Miguel Martinez, founder of El Phoenix Restaurant, began the restaurant, the Martinez Cafe, at his home on the corner of Griffin and McKinney Avenue, which is out here in this area. It was initially located on the other side of Woodrow Rogers Freeway from its present location today at 1601 McKinney Avenue. The business had grown to multiple units at a time, and the business sold to a private company in 2008. The El Phoenix Ballroom, popular in the 1930s, was located next to the restaurant. The El Phoenix Orchestra provided the music for ballroom, dancing, and sometimes other musicians or bands would play at the ballroom. Martinez offered guests lively nighttime entertainment, making the restaurants and ballroom a Dallas hotspot. Live Saturday night radio broadcasts were also transmitted from the ballroom. Another business that continued to the present time is the Hernandez Grocery Market, established in 1918 by Pedro Hernandez at 2120 Alamo Street, which is over here close to what we now consider American Airlines Center. He and his wife, Socorro Navarro Hernandez, owned and operated the business next to their home and near the corner of McKinney Avenue. The market carried fresh meats, produce, canned goods, and many Mexican products, such as pan de dulce and tortillas. It continued to operate until 2009, and today continues to be family-owned and operated in Garland, Texas. Luna's Tortillas and Hacienda, today located in Northwest Dallas, has its roots at 2209 Carolina Street near McKinney Avenue. The business was founded in 1924 by Maria Luna, a single mother of two, started the business from her home. Each morning, she would take masa, which is dough, for the tortillas to the home of neighborhood women to be rolled out and cooked, and picked up the tortillas they cooked from the previous day to sell them throughout the day to local business. In 1938, she built a new factory at 1615 McKinney Avenue. The current business is owned and operated by grandson Fernando Luna and his family. Other businesses that could be found on McKinney Avenue were the Original restaurant next to the 1615 McKinney Avenue Luna Tortillas location and operated by Casamira Valdez, sister to Maria Luna. Another one was La Botica Chica, the little drugstore, owned and operated by Rudy Benavides. They also had La Perlita, which is the Little Pearl, a general store selling newspapers, magazines, and books from Mexico, Mexican candies, and also medicinal herbs. That was owned by Adolfo and Agustina Tapia, the White Kitchen restaurant owner. Julian Rocha, the Taxo restaurant owned by Joe Navarro's family. El Farolito Cafe, owned by Federico Estrada and later by his sons, Gilbert, Fred, and Elmo. The P&M Shoe Shop at 1600 Bikini Avenue again, owned by the brothers Pascual and Manuel Delgado. Zambrano Studios, owned by Samuel Zambrano, who started his business from home on Bookout, was also another one. You know, we talked earlier about Pedro Hernandez Market. Interesting thing about this gentleman, he and his wife started the business using their own money. When my parents first came to Dallas from Laredo, Texas, right after World War II, they moved into the barrio. And my dad had always told us that Don Pedro was what people in Little Mexico considered the Godfather. And in a way that he was the one that communicated with the Anglo community, the city council, the police department, and everything. So if anybody got in trouble, they would go to him and he would work out the differences with the families. Mr. Hernandez also had a policy in his store. If he caught somebody shoplifting, especially young kids, he wouldn't call the police on them. He would actually go to the house of the young man and talk to them and tell them, look, if you need something, I'll give it to you, but don't steal it. And the reason he didn't want to report the police, because he didn't want the young man to have a record. He didn't want the record to follow him while he was growing up. Now his wife, Socorro, when we talk nowadays about glass ceiling and women, she was one of the first that refused to let man open the door for her when he walked in. She felt that she was strong enough to open herself, and she was equal to open the door and walk in first. That was her way of thinking of women had to be just as equal to men on it. Interesting stories about that too, is that even now, his grandkids still operate the business in Garland, Texas. And they still have the original cash register and the safe that we exhibited at the Dallas Mexican American Historical League exhibited. And it's just unbelievable of the history that we have. There's another restaurant that no longer exists called Cuquitas, which is on Harry Hines. I remember that restaurant because he was at a house. The family lived in the back, and the living room was the restaurant. And people would go and eat there. I mean, late at night, or early in the mornings. So it was stores like that and restaurants that started like that. Little Mexico, when you look at all of this here, no longer exists. Nowadays, it's called Uptown. And we've lost our history of people. And this is why I think it's very important that we never forget barrios like Little Mexico. In Dallas itself, at one time, there were 16 barrios, Little Mexico being the biggest one, because all the commercial was coming in. We had barrios in West Dallas, La Bajada. Trinity Grove now is La Bajada. Los Altos, which is part of Oak Cliff now. There was a place called El Pozo, which is by Fair Park. No longer exists. Neighborhoods there, and each neighborhood had its own little stores. Each neighborhood had its own religious churches. And yes, each neighborhood had their own little gangs. And I was part of the gang from Little Mexico, growing up there. The Little Mexico gang was the main heart of the Mexican community back then. Pikes Park, we were not allowed there for a long time. When I say we, the generation, my parents and them, it was a white only. It wasn't until later that we were allowed to go in there. As a young boy, I remember going to the swimming pool they had there. And we couldn't swim in the mornings because it was fresh water. And only the whites could go in. At the end of the day, they let us go in because it was water being used already. That was the type of deals we were. People are not aware that for a long time, we couldn't speak Spanish in the city of Dallas. I grew up, I was fortunate that my grandmother lived with us for a while. So we had to speak Spanish constantly. But at one time, it was a law. You couldn't speak in public schools and city properties Spanish. And that's why nowadays you see a lot of young people that never learn how to speak Spanish because their parents were afraid that they learn how to speak Spanish, they will get in trouble back then. We're blessed that some of us, in particular my grandkids, they're bilingual. Yet, this is what Dallas has always been. And our community had been the forgotten community for a long time. An interesting fact now that the population of Dallas now is almost 42% Hispanic. The Dallas Independent School District is 70% Hispanic, with 68% have been of Mexican heritage. The school superintendent is a Mexican American that grew up in Oak Cliff. If you go back to Oak Cliff now, Oak Cliff is 70% Hispanic. If you're familiar with the Dallas area and Oak Cliff, you can get on Jefferson Boulevard, starting on 35 and head towards Grand Prairie. And you'll see every other store, a Mexican store. You see grocery stores, you name them. It's Little Mexico. And it goes back then in Little Mexico, what I talked about. People are not aware that before Little Mexico, it used to be called Goose Valley. It was a Jewish community. And then we came in and moved in. My grandmother, who lived with us in the housing projects, used to say that she could walk from Little Mexico to Little Jerusalem in one block, because she went from store to store on it. That's the history that people are not aware that exists. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dia Berry Mitchell, and I'm here today to talk to you about the history of Black foodways right here in Dallas, Texas. So I'm actually here by way of the Dallas Historical Society, which is where I'm employed full-time, and I produce educational events and also ensure that we have programming that best highlights our exhibits that are on display every day. And in my spare time, I operate a small business named Nostalgia Black that aims to preserve Black cultural history. Now, we do this through 3 different products and services. The first way is through writing and public speaking. The second way is through a line of tours called Soul of DFW. And the third way is our most recent production, which is an app, aptly titled Nostalgia Black App. So I'm here today to briefly go over a few ways that Black peoples have incorporated various food traditions into everyday activities, specifically here in the Dallas-Fort Worth community. So obviously keep in mind that we're not a monolith, and sometimes there may be some overlap within the broader context of Southern culture. But for the most part, we've identified the following ways that have commonalities within the Black diaspora. So we're going to talk a little bit about freedom, resistance, spirituality, and celebrations within the Black community. First up, let's talk about freedom. We as Texans can't have a conversation about freedom without referencing the General Order Number 3, or what's most commonly known as the Juneteenth document. So it's currently housed at the Dallas Historical Society, right there at Fair Park. And right there on the screen, what you're looking at is the summary of the order. And it was printed in newspapers throughout Texas. So that is a copy of it. So after the proclamation was enabled in 1863, freedmen's towns began springing up all over the United States. Freedmen towns were African-American municipalities or communities that were built by freedmen or former slaves who were emancipated during and after the Civil War. Now, these towns emerged in a number of states, most notably right here in Texas. So here specifically in Dallas, we had about 6 very well-known communities. Among them, one of the oldest and most well-preserved communities of Joppy. Another is still very much so inhabited, and I'm sure you've heard of it, and it's called Deep Ellum. So that's what we're going to take a look at shortly. So even the name itself, Deep Ellum, it's a moniker bestowed upon the community upon its founding by Black freedmen who indicated the direction of the neighborhood was further south, or deeper, as we sometimes say, the deeper part of Elm Street. Elm Street was pronounced Ellum due to their accents. Now, by the time the first train rolled into Dallas in 1872, there were already about 500 African Americans who were living there. And it was still considered, just like it is now, a cultural mecca of sorts. One example of this are the Derensburg brothers, who relocated from New Orleans to Dallas in the 1930s, and soon they began opening cafes and bars and hotels in both Dallas and Fort Worth areas. Now, during this time, many other African Americans expressed their freedom by establishing businesses and navigating the hospitality industry, specifically restaurant businesses. Now, we know that there are 3 specific types of foods that were commonly sold right here in Dallas due to cost and availability. If you take a look at the pink item in the middle there, it's a little block and it shows Deep Ellum. The streets that it's showing right now are those between the block of Pacific and Elm Street. So there were 6 cafes, if you can see that, or diners within that very, very small radius. And the 3 foods that we're referencing that were commonly sold in cafes and restaurants in Dallas at that time were fried chicken, barbecue, and fried fish. So now let's talk about resistance and how foods were used in resistance right here in Dallas as well. So as you may know, travel culture of Black Americans was shaped by the historical oppression of communities' rights to free movement. From the 1890s until around 1965, segregation laws prevented Black Americans from public spaces like restrooms, communities, and of course, restaurants. Now, despite those humiliations of the era, Black Americans found a way through resourcefulness to ensure that they could both travel and sustain themselves. At that time, shoebox lunches did just that. So because at that time it wasn't safe to stop along the road, or perhaps they rode trains and they weren't permitted to be served in the dining cars, many African Americans began packing portable lunches into shoeboxes. Now, a few things that they packed in there that made sense, if you think about it, were fried chicken, maybe a piece of fruit, slice of bread, and also pound cake. So during this time of travel, 44 of the 89 counties that line the iconic Route 66 were home to things we called sundown towns, communities where non-white travelers, they weren't welcome within city limits after sunset. So what do we do about that? Well, a guidebook was created specifically for African-American travelers, and it was created and published by an African-American gentleman by the name of Victor Hugo Green. Now, he did this between 1936 and 1966 during the era of Jim Crow laws. This enabled Black travelers to find restaurants, lodging, businesses, gas stations that would help serve them specifically while they were on the road. And many of them, because of this, were able to find safe spaces. So one of them in particular that was found inside the Green Book was located right here in Dallas, Texas, and it was called Beaumont Barbecue. So you're looking at a photo of Beaumont Barbecue right now. This photo was taken in about 1936, and Beaumont Barbecue opened around 1926 or so. And again, it was located in Dallas in the Deep Ellum area of town, what is known today also as Deep Ellum. And it's important to note that there were only 2 barbecue spots in the entire state of Texas that were listed in the 1937 edition of the Green Book, and Beaumont Barbecue was one of those 2. Now, regarding spirituality, there are a multitude of examples of ways that spirituality has been used, beginning with West African traditions using food and spiritual practices. But in the interest of time, let's go ahead and jump ahead a few hundred years to examine the tradition known as dinner on the ground, which, by the way, I wrote about in detail in a September issue of the Dallas Morning News. So during the enslavement period in the United States, the Black community typically received food rations on Saturday evenings, ushering in the larger communal dining experience that we have today for Sunday dinners. Now, there's also a very long-standing tradition within African American church cultures that after the preaching and the singing and the praying is over, everyone heads to the church dining hall for Sunday dinners. Now, this practice itself is somewhat altered for religions that often held services that lasted sometimes all day. I know because I'm a product of one that did things like that. So for these smaller churches that didn't have kitchens and dining halls, we would begin packing up these elaborate dinners and arranging potlucks outdoors that were often referred to as dinner on the ground. Now, we still have these today, but they're much less common. So now lastly, let's talk about examples of celebratory food traditions within the Black diaspora that are listed right here on the slide. So we have things like red lemonades made with cherries and strawberries. Those were the food colorings that were used during the 1870s and 1880s. Now this transitioned later on to red soda pop in the 1890s as carbonated beverages became more prevalent. And by the 1920s, powdered drinks reigned supreme, thanks to the invention of Polypop and also Kool-Aid. So in addition to those anchoring public celebrations, red drinks became firm fixtures in African-American homes and also in soul food restaurants. So my name is Dia Berry Mitchell, and I do appreciate your time. You can find me at What Didi Says on Instagram, and also drop me a line through email at dia@nostalgiablack.com. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Betsy Brody, and I am so excited to be here at the Legacies Dallas History Conference to tell you about my oral history project called Digging In: How Food, Culture, and Class Shape the Story of Asian Dallas. Since this project is largely about stories, it's fitting that I start by telling you a little bit about the story of how I came to be doing this kind of research. I grew up in Dallas in the 80s as the child of immigrants from India, and a very special memory that I have of my family growing up is of every Sunday going out to a different restaurant. My parents were particularly interested in trying all of the different types of food that were out there, and particularly interested in different types of Asian food. So I spent my childhood going to mom and pop restaurants in Dallas, Vietnamese food, Thai food, Indian food, all of it. And then went away to college, went away to grad school, and spent my professional career and academic career researching immigrant integration, how immigrants integrate into their new communities in various parts of the world and various parts of the country. So when I came back to Dallas to live and to work in the early 2000s, I continued to explore this research interest of mine. And I was really surprised to find that there was a gap between what I had lived in my experience as a person who lived and ate in Dallas and as the reality of what the academic literature had covered in this area. So in other words, there's very little information about Asians in Dallas, very little systematic study of Asians in Dallas. And further, very little information about the Asian food scene in Dallas in the academic literature. So I put my two areas of interest together and realized that this would be a really good way to look at the growth of the Asian population in Dallas, to look through the lens of food. So this project, Digging In, is an oral history and archival research project that explores the growth of the Asian community in Dallas and how it coincided with the rise of foodie culture in Dallas, and the ways that that coincidence led to unique opportunities for economic and social engagement between and among different Asian immigrant groups, as well as with the larger Dallas community. So first, I wanted to say a word about why I chose this research design. Oral history lends itself really well to what I'm trying to do here, because this is an area where, as I said, there are very few people doing research on the Asian communities in Dallas, despite it being a very growing and large population of Dallas. So oral history gives us the opportunity to center the voices and the experience of the people who lived the story, and also to create primary sources at the same time. So this is a really important way to highlight and center the stories of Asian restaurant owners and grocery store owners in Dallas, as well as to bolster the record of this community in the historical literature. The archival research part of this project is also really interesting. I'm looking at restaurant reviews of the restaurants, the Asian restaurants and grocery stores that I'm researching, and tracking them and coding them on questions of what were critics looking for, what made a particular place popular, what was considered authentic by the diners in these restaurants. So all of this has been really fun, and hope that it coincides with building the historical record on Asian communities in Dallas, and also helping to understand the ways that food-centered businesses offer opportunities for immigrants to integrate into their new communities in different ways. I would be remiss if I didn't say that this research is funded by an ACLS Mellon Community College Faculty Fellowship, and I appreciate the opportunity to both be able to conduct this research and conduct these oral histories, to archive them at Baylor's Institute for Oral History, and also to present to the ACLS Mellon community in the future. So why Dallas? Why study this issue in Dallas? So first of all, Dallas is unique when we look at the different cities in Texas in terms of the Asian community, because Dallas did not have a significant Asian population until much later than cities like Houston or El Paso. So the timing of Asians coming to Dallas really coincides with the change in the immigration laws in 1965, as well as with 1975, the end of the Vietnam War and the arrival of refugees from Vietnam to Dallas. So the timing in Dallas makes doing this research somewhat different and interesting, because we have a definite start point for when we can start seeing these ethnic restaurants, Asian grocery stores popping up in this particular city. Also of note is that in Dallas, there is a huge range within what we call the Asian community. So when we disaggregate the what we call the Asian community, we can see that there are about 25 different ethnic groups, all with their own different traditions, their own different culture, language, and cuisine. So all of this makes Dallas a really interesting and rich place to study immigrant integration, particularly Asian communities within a big city. Also, I want to talk about why food. Obviously, we all love food, and it is a very accessible way to learn about other cultures and to kind of dip your toe into learning about the way that people live in other parts of the world. Also, though, from the immigrant's perspective, food-centered businesses are a really accessible point of entry into their new homes, into the social and economic ecosystem of their new cities. So you see this not just in Dallas, not just in Texas, not just in the United States, but around the world, that when immigrants come to a new place, they will often choose food-centered businesses as an entryway. It starts often with just simply trying to source the ingredients for the foods that they're familiar with and the foods that they would like to cook that would make them feel more at home. But often, branches out into a bigger business opportunity as the community grows and more people want those same ingredients and more people want those same foods. So restaurants also give an opportunity for people within the native, if you will, community to have a taste of the food from another country and the taste of the culture of their new neighbors. So restaurants and grocery stores, in other words, serve as both hubs and bridges for communities within any city that has a large number of immigrants. So this project aims at looking at the actual voices and the actual experiences of people who came to Dallas in the early 80s and a little bit before that in the 70s and established food-related businesses. So by doing oral histories, I'm able to talk to the people and get sort of a sense of what it felt like, what it was like for them, what obstacles were in the way of starting these types of businesses, and the experiences that they had. So these anecdotes that are being related to me in the oral history interviews are really rich and actually very heartwarming in many cases because of the way that the businesses themselves serve to be both a place of comfort for their own communities as they grew, and also as a way to connect with and build relationships with the larger Dallas community. So two stories that I want to highlight for you today are from a grocery store, Indian grocery store called the Taj Mahal Imports. And this was a store that was established in 1983 in Richardson by Pramod and Renuka Shah. They were the owners. When they started out, they had 3,000 square feet of grocery store, and they simply stocked it, as they said in their interview, to supply any Indian lady with the foods that she would need to make dinner for her family. But eventually, over time, they grew to 16,000 square feet and were the largest Indian grocery store in the United States at one point. I just want to bring up a couple of different things that they sold there and that served as a useful resource for the Indian community within Dallas. And really not just Dallas. People were driving from Lubbock, from Amarillo to come to get their groceries in Dallas at the Taj Mahal Imports. So one neat thing that they did was they stocked videos of the most popular movies in real time in India. So if you think about 1983, we didn't have streaming services, didn't have the internet or anything. A real tie to home would be to be able to watch the same movies that your friends back in India, that your family back in India were watching. And so the Shahs would stock their store with an entire wall of VHS cassettes of the latest movies from India. And people would come in on the weekends and mill about, look at the videos that were available, rent them, and take them home and watch them during the week. Another way that the Taj Mahal served as a hub was in selling phone cards. And those phone cards were used to call India at a lower rate than what their carriers at long distance carriers would be able to supply. I want to move on here and talk about the way that the Taj Mahal Import served as a bridge within the community. So first of all, India is a huge country with many, many different states and many, many different languages. So to say that you have an Indian grocery store in Texas, doesn't mean that necessarily that you have everything that everybody who came from India would need. So the Shahs went to extra care and extra trouble to make sure that people from various parts of the Indian community could feel comfortable to find the products that they wanted and needed, and that those products would be sourced. And they even went so far as to have translations of all the different names of the products across the different Indian languages. Another interesting anecdote that came out of their interview was that they started to stock British goods, largely because there was an influx of Indian immigrants who came from England. So people who were from India had immigrated to England and then were coming to Texas. there were candies and jams and things like that that those people were familiar with and missed from London. And so the Shaws, again, trying to provide good customer service and provide what their customers wanted, would turn over and the Shaws would supply those so that those customers would be able to feel comfortable. So that was how they started to supply British goods. In the interest of time, I'll just mention that the Royal China Restaurant, which was run by the Gao family, is a very popular neighborhood fixture that serves more non-Asian clientele. And they were very clear in their interviews that they view their menu as an opportunity to educate their clientele on the different types of cuisine that are offered and are authentic to China. So this is a way of serving as a bridge between the idea of authenticity, of serving authentic Chinese food and connecting to the community. So with that, I will stop and thank you again for letting me share about this project.
Okay, now that we've heard from everyone on our panel, we're going to go into discussion mode. There was a lot there, I think, there's so many different ways to go in this whole topic area. I feel like we could dig in to anybody's story and just get deeper into what was going on with these groups who have made Dallas the very rich place that it is today. One of the things that I'm wondering is, and I think each of you can talk about this, you talked about so many traditions that were bedrock to the groups that came to Dallas. How do you think these traditions have strengthened or died away with time? You know, have they been co-opted? Like where you have places like Central Market making tortillas now? Or have they somehow been strengthened within the communities?
Who wants to take that first? I'll go ahead and start. Dia Barry Mitchell, thank you for the introduction, Kim, and I'm so excited to be here today with this esteemed panel of guests. As far as traditional foodways within the Black community, I spoke a little bit about celebratory food traditions, and from my own experience, I was born and raised in Sherman, Texas, and food was such a large part of our community, as is, I'm sure everyone else can attest to. Juneteenth, for example, I'll speak about that briefly, since that's something that has gotten it's gotten a lot of hype and publicity lately, rightfully so, and it's now considered a national holiday, which obviously we're excited about that, but it started here in Texas, and it was funny because I did some research about that, and when I was younger, growing up in the 80s, it is something that we celebrated, and it was just a part of the community. I grew up knowing about the holiday. It wasn't anything, it was just a part of the community. And so it was something that we celebrated all the time, and obviously food was a large part of that. The red drink that I spoke about, red velvet cupcakes and cakes and things like that, barbecue played a huge, huge part in it, especially up near the Red River where we were from. But as far as whether or not I can say that it's been co-opted, it has grown, as I mentioned, but I don't feel like it's been co-opted. It's just made it larger, obviously. It's strengthened it. And then also I wanted to go back and say that during my research, I noticed that it had actually died out. So we know, the first one took place in 1866, the first Juneteenth celebration, also known as Freedom's Day in a lot of communities. And the very first one took place in Joppy, Texas. I mentioned that a little earlier. That was an African-American settlement known as Freedmanstown. And from there, it grew and we had other ones. But then eventually it died down in around the 1980s or so. Early 1990s, it comes back. And so I'm really grateful that for whatever reason, it did die out in the 70s and 80s somewhat, and then it came back around. And so that's been really interesting to see it being recognized nationally now, and all of these people are celebrating it. And it's really been an amazing experience, and I hope that it will continue.
In terms of the research that I'm doing, one of the emerging themes that I didn't really hit on in my presentation is this idea of authenticity and status. So when I'm talking to the narrators, the people who are restaurant owners or grocery store owners, they have their reasons why they put this or that on their menu. It's a choice. In some cases, that choice is motivated by a desire to educate and to introduce a culture to their customers. In other cases, it's a choice about sales, right? This is a thing that people like, and this is a thing that people will buy. And we want to please our customers, and we want to sell a lot of this product, whatever it is. And in other cases, it's a particular desire to just make sure that we have this on our menu because it's important to us, or we have this in our store because it's important to us. So when I'm juxtaposing that piece of the research straight from the narrators' mouths with the restaurant reviews, what's really interesting is that a restaurant review puts the person who's eating at the center of the story, right? And how they feel about this dish on this particular day. And that's an entirely different calculation than what the person who put it on the menu in the first place is thinking. And so, but when you read a restaurant review in, the Dallas Morning News or in the Dallas Observer or D Magazine, it's a guide for a whole different population to make judgment calls about that restaurant or about that grocery store. So that's been really interesting to think about what the eater perceives as authentic versus what the person who is creating the menu thinks is authentic or is important to have on the menu. So I don't know if that's the same as co-optation, but rather, this question of what's real, what's authentic.
When I get asked, where's your favorite Mexican restaurant? I always just say, at home. Because my mom was a great cook. Okay, let's think about this now. And I'm going to show my age. I was around in the 50s, 60s, okay? Tacos. Think about that. We got Taco Bell selling tacos. There's a story about a family in Mexico. A gentleman, a young man, was going to high school, Crozier Tech High School, downtown. His mother used to make tortillas, handmade, with frijoles, which beans, for lunch, to wrap them. He would go to school. At lunch, he was so embarrassed because they would make fun of him eating something that didn't look good. So he would eat it, make sure nobody saw him. One day, there was this big football player, Anglo. And he's looking at him and said, what do you got there? And he said, this, can I try it? And he gave him one. And he bit it. And he loved it. He said, where'd you get this? My mom makes it. So I said, have your mom make it and I'll buy them from you. So next day, he brings a couple in for him and he gives him a couple of dollars. Okay, and he loved them. So he takes one taco to his family. The family comes to my friend's house and wanted to buy some tacos. All of a sudden, he became popular. Everybody was eating them. That's how Mexican food first started. Yes. Nowadays, you have these fast food places. Again, I don't have my mom anymore. I don't have my grandmother. But I'm very lucky that I have a wife that loves to cook. Okay? And all you got to do is look at me. You see, I like to eat. All right. Now, food has really become tacos, margaritas. The margarita first drink was invented here in Dallas. A young man that owned a restaurant here, he has a machine that made it. It now sits at the museum in Washington, D.C. No. Again, it goes back to the taste, the Mexican food. Tex-Mex, they call it now. A lot of them love the Tex-Mex food. Nachos, We used to love menudo. Okay. We used to call it the breakfast of champions before Wheaties came out with that phrase. Okay. I mean, we had all kinds of food. Huevos rancheros. No, frijoles, beans. Let me tell you a little story about beans. My grandmother, let me go back. One of my mom's aunts stayed with us for a while. And we used to have beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was during the polio epidemic. And she always said, you gotta eat beans. It'll keep you from getting polio. So we ate beans. We don't any better, you know. But we loved it, you know. And now refried beans is real popular and all these kind of beans. So the Mexican food has been around for years. It's been embraced by everybody, you know. And every time I hear my grandkids, they want something to eat, you know. Every now and then they'll say, I want a pizza, you know. I say, you want a what? Okay, Grandpa, we'll go eat Mexican food with you. But that's what I see the food industry going into. So many Mexican restaurants now, or they serve Mexican food. There's a place called Dunstan Steakhouse.
Yes.
You know what's the most popular dinner they order there? The enchiladas. I didn't know that, you know. I used to go eat, you know, steaks. And there they have a menu, enchiladas. And the waitress was telling me, oh, we get a lot of people come and eat enchiladas here. So it's all mixed in there.
That's a really interesting story about sharing, and I think there's some parallels within the Asian communities as well. The story you told about the tacos, both in this project that I'm working on and the Vietnamese refugees project, this theme of sharing food came up a lot, and in the equivalent of the taco in this world is the egg roll. So this was a thing that, you know, especially with the Vietnamese refugees that I interviewed, a lot of them had grandmothers that lived in the same household as a result of the, you know, the way that the whole family came as refugees. And so the grandma would be, you know, in the apartment while the kids were at school and the parents were at work, and would stay busy by making egg rolls and then sharing those with neighbors, with the sponsors, with church communities. This was something that was new to the people that they were sharing with, that they really liked and wanted more of. So quickly the grandmas became entrepreneurs selling these egg rolls to all the people that wanted them. And so it turned out to be quite a good cross-cultural exchange, as well as a business opportunity.
Very nice.
Go ahead.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
It's actually kind of come up. I was curious to know, I know how I feel about the subject, but we talked a lot about other cultures, or maybe restaurateurs when they take certain foodways and then they begin selling those for profit. How do you feel about when those foods are sold and maybe there isn't necessarily a history about the foods known by the people who are selling it? Is that ever an issue for you, or how do you feel? So I'll say why I'm asking. So that actually happened to me a few years ago, not very long ago. I went to traditionally like a Southern restaurant, and while I was in there, one of the foods that were being sold that was on the menu was a hoe cake. And a hoe cake, if you don't know, is traditional, like a bread from within the Black diaspora. And when we began talking about hoe cakes with the person I was with, the waitress, she really didn't know what it was. And, you know, I couldn't fault her for it, but it did make me wonder how other people feel about their foods and when they are then sold for profit in restaurants and there isn't any history known about the ingredients or the foods. Is that important to you, or how do you feel about that?
Well, I guess this question of appropriation is, you know, is always a little bit fraught, right? On the one hand, you know, as I expressed in my presentation, this idea of a bridge is really appealing, you know, of these restaurants and food being an avenue into people understanding each other better and people appreciating cultures that are different than their own. So on the one hand, it's appealing to have people reach across those cultural boundaries. On the other hand, the question of respect and really understanding, it seems to need to go hand in hand with that. So I don't really have an answer to the question, but I guess it's coming up a lot in this project because of the sort of high cuisine, sort of the fancy restaurants that are serving these types of foods versus, what some would characterize as the more authentic, in some regards, mom and pop shops that would never be necessarily, conceived of as being fancy enough or upscale enough. So it's a hard line to walk, I think.
I think it's interesting what you just brought up. There's always this secret ingredients recipe or something that you may not want to share with people. You see in the paper where one restaurant owner suing the other restaurant owner for taking the recipe and so on that, which is really kind of, amazing because we've been doing that for years and years, on it. Take our example of tortillas, they were made at home by moms, okay? Then all of a sudden, some chef somewhere figures, hey, I can put a tortilla and I can put an egg or beans, and he becomes the one that started tortilla, okay? Which is, it just goes on. Growing up as a little boy, my favorite tortilla was the one made out of corn, okay? Masa harina, we used to call it. My grandmother, even when I was in high school and even went off to college, every time I go visit her, I would bring her a 5-pound bag of masa harina. Because the next time I came, she said, just let me know, and she would have some made for me. My mom did the same thing. And to this day, my wife will make them and we bring them. But it's I guess people do things for money. And it all boils down, it's all about money. If I can take something that you made and maybe tweak it a little bit, I'm gonna do it, whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's happening on it.
Do you feel like something is lost? I mean, it's almost like there's this tension between sharing and being able to introduce people to the culture, and yet what I've noticed what you were talking about, where the reviewer you're exactly right, is writing from their experience, which may or may not at this point in time be appropriate. I remember that for years and years and years, we would call your foods ethnic foods. Well, they're not ethnic to you if you're
or exotic foods.
So there has been certainly a learning curve, but then you have things like Taco Bell, which to me is, I'll just say it, Albert, to me that's a real corruption of your food and your culture.
Interesting thing I saw on Facebook. That's the only thing I'm in Facebook, because my generation, that's all we can do, Facebook. Okay. And I saw an article that said Taco Bell was rated #1 in text food.
Yes. Wow.
And I thought, darn, who voted for that? Because if you could probably count in one finger how many times I've been to Taco Bell.
That's enough.
And only because that was the only place open so late at night and I needed something. But I mean, that's what's happening nowadays. People are beginning to confuse everything. All of a sudden, you're right. I haven't heard the word ethnic food anymore. It used to,
You did.
Yeah, it used to. You got a lot of restaurants serving, and I love Japanese food. I finally learned, after so many years, use chopstick.
Oh, good for you.
So my grandkids taught me. I had grandkids that can do that real quick, And we went to eat, and I said, I can't, Grandpa, we're going to show you. And they know it, But, it's interesting how the food industry and chefs come out. I laugh at times because I have some pajamas. And when I'm walking around the house, I tell my wife, I got my chef's uniform. Because of the colorful things, I've seen some on it. But again, it goes back, I get to people. And really, believe it or not, more and more people of color are being represented. And I don't want to use the word overtake, but eventually become the majority.
We're on our way to that.
On it. And that's what we eat. That's what we like.
I would like to add, I do think that this gives us an amazing opportunity for those of us who are interested in educating. I myself, with Nostalgia Black, we aim, as I mentioned before, to preserve Black culture. One of the ways that we do that is through tourism. So if you get on my bus tour, Soul of DFW, that's one of the things we love to do, is to educate about Black culture. And we do that through two different ways. One is foodways. So it gives you an opportunity to take control of the narrative and feed people, and then teach them about your community within your food, and then also by visiting historical sites. So I think that does give us an opportunity to kind of take the bull by the reins, so to speak, and educate when you see that there's an issue with people not necessarily knowing about where food comes from or how it originated. It does give us an amazing opportunity to take advantage of that.
Do you get a mixed clientele on that? Do you tend? I know we're talking about racial and ethnic designations just because that's the nature of this conversation.
Yeah.
But who tends to come on your
That's
tours?
actually a great question. And obviously we've been on hiatus for almost 2 years now due to COVID, but I really loved going on the tour, hosting it. Every tour was like a learning experience for myself, because we get a mix of people. So we get all different classes, all different ages, ethnic groups. And so it was really never particularly one group that was larger than the other. So that's one of the things that I really loved about doing the tours, and I can't wait to get back on it again so I can help people learn about different, restaurants that maybe they haven't heard of that are here in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. So.
I also digress, Betsy, to the Asian side of things. I recall that when I worked at the paper for the food section, there was a time, I think this was during the 1990s, where we did a whole cover on how to eat pho. And just because people, and even how to pronounce it.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Because people didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's just, it is fascinating looking at the old newspapers and magazines. I know exactly what you're talking about. And also there was actually a bus tour of ethnic restaurants that you could go on. So a precursor to your business. And you could go around and it was literally billed as like an ethnic restaurant tour, bus tour. So you could go around and try all these exotic things. But just sort of to bring these two threads of the conversation together, I think food is different than a lot of the other arguments and conversations that people have about race and ethnicity and identity, because it is, the very nature of it is that people have, for all history, come together to eat. right? And whether it was, cavemen around the campfire, the fire or whatever, people share meals together. It's a social activity, and it's a really nice and easy and oftentimes beautiful way to be introduced to a different culture. So it's, like your story of learning from your grandkids how to use chopsticks and to be exposed to Japanese food, which you love, right? That's a different type of conversation about race and identity and ethnicity than many of the ones that we're part of as part of just politics or regular society. So I think that, I don't know, I feel hopeful when we're talking about food because there's so much to learn, the education piece that you're talking about, and so much to learn from other people's stories, like what we've learned today from yours. And yet there's so much that people can come together on and appreciate and agree on, like, this is delicious, right? Yeah. Or I really had a good time eating this, or I really had a great time learning about this aspect of your culture, and I will have that with me from now on. And I learned about a new thing I like to eat that I can share with my friends. So it feels like a ripple effect is possible.
Well, let me go back and ask you, let's go back into some of the history and tell me, I would like to see each of you expand on the role that the corner store plays in these different communities. Now, I have to say with the Asian community, that's a little more challenging because for a long time you didn't have, there was a more diffuse areas where people lived. They didn't all live in one small area like the barrio or Black neighborhoods. But to the extent that you can, tell me how the corner store anchored these communities and anchored them to their foods.
Definitely. I mentioned a little bit about the Freedmen's communities and Deep Ellum specifically, and just within that kind of block radius that we spoke about, that's one example, but there were corner stores everywhere. And this was obviously out of necessity because they weren't able to just walk into any other corner store. So out of accessibility, it had to be there. And then obviously once construction of the highways came through, you had zoning laws and policy laws and infrastructure really that affected and impacted people largely, so that it was still kind of a segregated, smaller section. And so again, it was out of necessity that they had these corner stores, but now it was a matter of they were the closest in proximity. And so that corner store now held a very special significance in the community. It was a place where people could come and congregate for news, for example, get items to eat, food to eat, and things like that. I think even still today, it's still significant in a number of communities. In South Dallas, for example, corner stores are still very popular. You can go in, you can pay bills, you can get some small grocery items. They have a grill. You can get food to go. So there are a number of items, even grocery items that are hard to find, but they're very specific within the Black community. So even things like, I'll say this and it may not resonate with everyone, but there's a drink called a knee-high peach drink, and it is highly popular within the Black community. You can get things like that at corner stores in South Dallas today. And so I think it holds a very special significance in the Black community even today. Even though obviously we can venture out, you are able to go to different stores. We have vehicles, so we can access highways and get to where we want to go. But this still holds a very special place in the heart of the communities there. So,
and then Mexico, when I was growing up, there were some corner stores. One in particular across the housing project where I grew up was called La Villita. It's a little store there. And it's very unique in the sense that was back then when my mom would go buy stuff and sign. And on Fridays, my dad, payday, would come and pay. Because back then, a man's word was a handshake. And I remember I was going to school, I would stop by and get some gum. And Mr. Villasana would see me, he'd write it down, you know. He never saw the one I put in my pocket before that, but he put one, you know. So when my dad would come, he'd go down the list, gum. Okay, he paid it, and he'd come, did you go by, get some gum? Yes, but I didn't think he saw me, but he did. But the corner stores were there. Mm-hmm. We used to go buy the bread, the milk, you know, things, because there were really no grocery stores close by, big ones. Mm-hmm. The nearest one was Safeway, and it was on the corner of Fairmont and Maple, which is just outside outskirts of Little Mexico. And we would go there maybe once a month, you know. But the majority of the time, when we needed something fast, we would go to those stores. Mm-hmm. We had the pharmacies there. We had the doctor. Mm-hmm. Even the funeral home was in the neighborhood there, you know. So it was really important. There were several of those stores like that. There was one particular close to the school I went to, the St. Anne's Catholic School. Mm-hmm. 1 block away from there was Nick or Nicolas store. Now, that man, it was interesting. After school, we would be walking home, and we all try to go in the store to buy something. But he would stop us at the door and say, wait a minute, one at a time. Okay, one at a time. It never dawned on us. I thought, you know, he was getting special attention. But it was trying to do, he thought we were all going to gang in there and start picking things up.
Mm-hmm. Watch you.
But, you know, that's the way he ran his business. Mm-hmm. You know, right 1 block down was a barbershop. You know, the man would cut our hair. We didn't have money, but when my dad went to get his hair cut, oh, Gonzalez, on this day I cut your son's hair. Well, no wonder, my dad said, no wonder I saw him the other day with short hair. Okay, they pay, you know. But it was that kind of a relationship that they had, the corner stores and stores with the community. Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting, and it's kind of parallel with the movies, the videos that I was talking about at the end of my presentation. And I can attest to this personally because I think I spent half my childhood in the parking lot of that grocery store because every weekend, and Kim, you're right, the Asian community, wasn't exactly a corner store, but literally people were driving every weekend, almost like an appointment shopping kind of thing, where they would go not just because they needed to get their groceries for the week, but also because they were going to see other people there and to exchange information. In their interview, the Shaws told me that there was one, and I remember seeing this, one whole wall of the store was, they called it the networking wall. And anybody that had, again, before the internet, anybody that had, needed a babysitter or was a babysitter or needed help finding an insurance company or had an insurance company, those types of things could post that up there. They said it was one whole wall. And it was particularly helpful, it sounds like, for newcomers, right? So people who were coming in, especially in, sort of even later, the 90s on the H-1B visas, and sort of the build up to Y2K, there were a lot of Indian H-1B visas issued for people in the tech industry. And so during that time period, people wanted to hit the ground running and get, apartments and childcare and insurance and all those things. And that's where people would go to sort of get, trusted information. So it was a bustling atmosphere every weekend because people were coming not just to get their food, but to exchange information and also socialize. There was in the corner a little sort of fast food area of the grocery store where they sold samosas and just sort of snack food. But, people would bring their families, have juice, fresh squeezed juice and things like that, and just sort of spend several, hours just kind of hanging out at the store. So there was that element as well, even though people had driven in.
Has there been an increase in the kinds of ingredients that make these foods really good? And I'm thinking of the import side. I'm also thinking about community gardens. It seems to me that there are things that we can get today. I may not know how to use it, but someone in the Asian community might, or well, I grow an herb. I'm an urban farmer too. I grow an herb called hoja santa, which I'll bet you recognize, Alberto. Albert.
You know, community gardens. Let me tell you something. My wife, Frances, is a master gardener. And she volunteers putting together community gardens. One of her pet projects right now is at Mountain View College, where they have a community garden. You know, so she has really brought a lot of vegetables to me. Now, I've got to tell you, when I first started dating her and we go out to eat, the first thing I used to reach out for was the salt. Okay? I remember first time we went out, I grabbed it, I put it. She didn't say nothing. Next time we went out, I reached out and she stopped it. She said, salt's not good for you. She said, if you come to my house, you're not going to find any salt. And to this day, I've never used salt anymore.
Wow.
You know, but she is into the community garden and the vegetables, which is really where we need to start going more and more.
Now, does she grow vegetables specific to your heritage, or
just
is it
for
more
everything, you know, everything.
American?
You know, my daughter started my little granddaughter for eating vegetables. As a little baby. Now, that's all she eats, vegetables. You know, because we started teaching them this is what you really need health-wise, you know, on it. And you know, I see that more and more that it has to come. Because look, I'm fixing to be 75 in a couple of days. Okay, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around here, but I want to live as long as I can, and I want my kids to live longer on it, you know. So, you know, I think it's a must. I've been to the, how you pronounce it, Bonton?
Bonton.
Yeah.
Bonton Farms.
Man, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We'll go over there and buy some things there now and then, you know. And it's things like that we need, you know. I live in Oak Cliff, in beautiful Oak Cliff, by choice and not a necessity. Food desert. There's not very many big grocery stores out there on it. And we need to have some type of gardening, food that's better for people. Because from the Hispanic point of view, we have the highest rate of diabetes, health-wise. We have a highest rate of COVID death because of conditions that we have, that we eaten stuff we should have eaten growing up. You know, I always blame my mom. She was getting older. She used to say, "You're putting on too much weight." Yes, Mom. Guess who put it there? You know? I said, no, don't you do that. Don't you blame me now, you know. But that's, you know, that's what we need to teach our kids nowadays. You know, it's better food to eat.
That's it actually made me think. I also grew up in a community that was largely urban based, I guess you would say. So we had a lot of gardening in our home, and so I grew up with a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, and I was spoiled in that way. But moving here to the Dallas Metroplex, I think we can all, you mentioned a little bit, Albert, about food deserts and food swamp communities. So you're either, for example, in Oak Cliff, either you have a plethora of food options, which are food swamps, which means that there are unhealthy options available for you, lots of fried food places, fast food restaurants, things like that. And there are like little to no grocery stores that offer viable food options, so which are the food desert communities. And I think there's not enough emphasis on the fact that we can use growing gardens as a way to sustain and offer healthy ways of living. And I think there are lots of places that are doing that to kind of raise awareness about it. But we definitely place a lot of blame sometimes on the communities themselves and asking them, oh, you should eat better. But that's hard to do when you don't have any other options near you. So I mentioned the corner stores, for example. They take on a lot of responsibility, because when there aren't any grocery stores and when the options are fast food restaurants or a corner store, and if you don't have a vehicle, transportation to get to those places, you have to eat what's readily available to you. And so by offering gardening and sustainable living, that gives people the chance to not only save money, but feed themselves and be healthier. And so I think that's a really great topic of conversation.
Is that almost getting back to what these communities were doing originally?
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't come here and just start eating macaroni and cheese.
Yeah.
Or even the soft drinks,
Mm-hmm.
the sodas.
Those were just for special occasions. You're right.
As they should
and so
be.
now, yeah, we have, because they're so readily available, we just eat those all the time. We're spoiled in that sense. So you have to kind of know how to temper it, a little bit. It would be really fun and easy for me to fall into something like that if I really wanted to. But luckily, it wasn't how I was raised. I was raised with people that gardened in my family and things like that. Showed me the proper way to prepare those. And so I think that's really important. But you're right, I could kill a big bowl of macaroni and cheese without a second thought. Yeah.
It's a kind of a cool thing to kind of jump in on the garden question. When the Vietnamese refugees first came to Dallas in 1975, that area that was called Little Asia in East Dallas, which is still there. There are still some of the original restaurants and so forth there. But part of that was a garden, a community garden that the Vietnamese refugees who were in all the voluntary organizations had their apartments and stuff that they were settling people in that area, walking distance. And so they established this little piece of land that's still there as a garden that the refugees could go in and grow the vegetables that would, be familiar to them and helpful to them in cooking and feeding their families, and also save money by not having to purchase other vegetables in the grocery stores. So that piece of land is still there. It was, very, very much used by the Vietnamese refugees. And then in subsequent waves, as Vietnamese refugees moved out of that particular area, after they got situated, got jobs and, felt settled and bought houses out in the suburbs, subsequent waves of refugees from other countries and other parts of the world continued to use that garden. So it's still there. And it's still being used, but different vegetables. So, so that's it's a really good point that that runs through all three of these themes.
Is there anything else that comes up for you guys on looking at this identity community and creating a sense of home in North Texas? Is there a story or an anecdote or something that comes to mind that you would like to share?
I think I would like to add the fact that we can never, and we should never forget the older generations, the people that built this country. I go back, and I keep telling my wife, the older I get, the more I realize what the greatest generation did for us. I don't care whether we're black, white, or brown. The greatest generation really made America great. And they've done this. And in studying my genealogy and then visiting with other people that did their genealogy, we find out black, white, brown, we all went through the same thing, their families, immigrants, The one group that got really abolished was the Native Americans. Then we have the blacks that were brought in chains here to be sold, to work the fields. And those same people brought the blacks to Texas to work the field for cotton. They took away the property from the Mexican people, and all for cotton. We have history. There's a good book that I just finished reading called Forget the Alamo. Have y'all read that?
No.
It's amazing. It tells you the real truth of the Alamo. You know, as a little kid, my dad bought a little TV, little square one. Walt Disney was on. And one of the episodes was David Crockett. I even remember my dad bought me a coon's cap as a kid. And they fought in the Alamo. You know, and I never really looked at it, hey, that's the Mexican side over here and it's a white guy. I just saw the good and the bad. But then I started seeing more and more. And as I left Little Mexico, and I moved to Oak Cliff, that's when I was reminded that I was different, that I was Mexican. The only year I went to public school was my 9th grade. I went to Bout Story Junior High. And there were probably 3 other Mexicans besides me. And you don't know how many times I heard when we got fighting, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo. You know, and I used to scratch my head, remember the Alamo, you know. And that, you know, that was already ingrained in the people's mind. But this book tells you the truth, that the Alamo was fought for one reason, slaves. Texas was part of Mexico. Mexico did not want slaves. And here comes the people across from Louisiana. Jim Bowie and his brother had 90 slaves to sell. Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, spent time in Mexico City trying to convince the government to remove that law that prohibited slaves to live there. And I'm trying to remember, and I'm sorry I don't remember exactly, but there's actually a town in Mexico where it's all Afro-Mexicans. You know.
And also the Underground Railroad
Yes,
went through
went
Mexico
through there.
as well. Went north, that was more popular, but there was a group, maybe upwards of 10,000 or so
Yeah.
African Americans that went south to Mexico instead.
George
I just
Keaton,
recently
you
read
know
that.
George
Yes,
Keaton?
yes, of course.
He has a film, I don't know if you know that, the village in Mexico that was all black,
Okay.
you know. And he showed it to us at a genealogy conference, you know. So it's all there, you know. And like I told my kids, or my grandkids especially, I don't blame the white people now for that. They're not to blame for what happened back then. Now, I do get upset when these people nowadays don't speak up against it. Because, you know, we're all the same human beings. You know, I'm going to say something real quick. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I was in the funeral business for so many years. And I prepared a lot of bodies, okay? Black, white, brown. And you know what thing we had in common? Every time I made an incision, what color came out?
Red.
Red. We're all the same, you know? And that's how we need to start thinking about, you know? And, you know, that's all I have to say, to be honest with you.
Would y'all have anything to add to this?
Thinking, I don't think I do.
No.
Yeah, that's a wonderful note, Tim.
Right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
we will keep building those bridges with food. We'll work on refining our understanding whether it's the book about the Alamo or getting reviewers to look in from a little different point of view at the food they're writing about. This has been an exhilarating panel. I wish we could go on and go, okay, let's go to this topic, let's go to this topic, let's go to this topic, because it's such a rich area, and we all love to eat.
Yeah.
So thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for participating in this year's Legacies Dallas History Conference. I hope you've enjoyed today's session and continue to learn more about the history of our city, gastronomically and otherwise. Hopefully, we'll meet in person next year. On behalf of the Dallas Public Library and the 23rd Annual Legacies Dallas History Conference, have a great 2022.